Well, polite persuasion over the planned shooting of drug traffickers Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran is gradually giving way to public frustration. Tony Abbott's language now includes expressions like "we feel grievously let down," and he's throwing in for good measure reminders that Australia rushed forward with $1 billion worth of foreign aid when Aceh was struck by the tsunami in 2004.
We will be making our displeasure known. We will be letting Indonesia know in absolutely unambiguous terms that we feel grievously let down. Let's not forget that a few years ago, when Indonesia was struck by the Indian Ocean tsunami, Australia sent $1 billion worth of assistance. We sent a significant contingent of our armed forces to help in Indonesia with humanitarian relief. I would say to the Indonesian people and the Indonesian government, we in Australia are always there to help you, and we hope that you might reciprocate in this way at this time. We can't just ignore this kind of thing. If the perfectly reasonable representations that we are making to Indonesia are ignored by them. We are doing no more for our citizens than Indonesia routinely does for its own citizens, and if it's right and proper for Indonesia to make these representations, if it's right and proper for other countries to heed Indonesia's representations, it's right and proper for us to make the representations and for them to be heeded.
So Tony Abbott there talking from Queensland a little earlier. If there's an implied threat in what he says, it's only that. It's only implied because the Foreign Minister is leading the diplomacy with Indonesia and she's refusing to publicly air what protest options she might use if the executions go ahead. Julie Bishop's been pressed on the possible recall of the ambassador to Jakarta or even cuts to foreign aid, and she says she's not going to preempt any actions. But Julie Bishop has been more upfront about the role of special envoys. This after we reported yesterday that Gareth Evans and others were being touted for a possible dash to Jakarta to plead for mercy. Julie Bishop's indicated that Australia's been making regular and quiet calls on envoys to play a role in recent months.
We have a number of people who have already undertaken this task. I'm not going to indicate publicly who they are, but we have had officials, envoys, representatives making representations to their counterparts at a very high level for some time. There have been written representations, personal representations, face-to-face meetings. Now, this has been occurring ever since we came into government and, of course, previous governments since the Howard government for these young men were convicted almost a decade ago. Their rehabilitation has been remarkable over that time, and I believe that is a factor that should be taken into account in seeking a stay of their executions. But these representations have been made by successive governments, successive ministers and prime ministers over many years, and now that it would have appeared that their final clemency bids were rejected on the 7th of January, we have obviously increased the level and frequency of the communications.
Well, taxpayers could be forced to give telecommunications companies up to $400 million if the federal government's plan to beef up national security laws succeeds. Security agencies want telcos forced to keep data on their customers' phone and internet use for 2 years. Now, the companies say it'll be expensive to safely store and retrieve the information, which is known as metadata. The government promised a substantial contribution to help the $40 billion sector to adjust, but so far hasn't said how much. There's now a ballpark.
Even at the highest estimate we've got, the cost of metadata retention is less than 1% of the total sector. So it seems like a small price to pay to give ourselves the kind of safety and the kind of freedom that people in a country like Australia deserve.
The government hopes Parliament will pass legislation for the scheme in the next couple of weeks, and industry figures we've contacted have described the costs for storing that data as significant, but as many of them are in a negotiation over how much the government might assist with, they're not putting a public figure on dollar amounts that they might be seeking. Now, being a treasurer or a former treasurer or even a shadow treasurer brings with it a pretty basic expectation that you'll have a head for numbers. But quick quiz questions over the years have caught out more than a few people in the portfolio. Questions like the current official cash rate for interest or even the price of fuel or milk have proved deceptively difficult for some. Now, Chris Bowen, a former treasurer and an aspiring one, has been caught in a numbers game with broadcaster Alan Jones. At issue, the tax-free threshold. Here's how he went last night.
At what point do we pay nothing for tax? No tax at all.
Well, you pay
up to
you get a tax-free threshold.
Yeah. What is it?
Well, you pay no tax.
Yeah, what is it?
Well, you get a low-income earners tax offset.
Tax-free threshold.
You get a low-income earners tax offset, which
what
then
is
provides.
The tax-free threshold?
Well, Alan, hang on.
Well, I don't know.
Hang on. He's the treasurer. I'm talking about detail. He doesn't know.
No.
What is the tax-free? There's a point up to which we don't pay any tax. What is that?
And then you get a low-income tax offset, which provides a refund to low and middle-income earners, Alan.
At which we
you
pay
raised
no
high-income superannuation.
I mean, the fellow's the treasurer.
So no number forthcoming from Chris Bowen there with Alan Jones, but a new day brought a new, more assured shadow treasurer, all briefed up and full of regret.
During a discussion about high-income superannuation, Mr Jones asked me a question about the tax-free threshold and tax rates, and I chose not to answer that question. I should have answered the question. In hindsight, it was a mistake not to answer the question, but I didn't see it being as relevant to the conversation at hand. Also, there was a little bit of confusion between Mr Jones and I about whether he was talking about superannuation tax or personal income tax, so I didn't answer the question. Now, in many of those hundreds of interviews that I do during the course of the year, many of them include factual questions, and 99% of the time that's not an issue. The question gets answered and nobody, of course, hears about it because the question's appropriately answered. I should have just appropriately answered the question last night, and if Mr Jones wanted to have time going through the tax thresholds, I should have engaged in that. In hindsight, that's a mistake that I didn't do so.
Mr Bowen, what is the tax-free threshold?
The tax-free threshold is $18,200, which is what I should have said last night.
Mr Bowen, do you concede that it is a bad look for a shadow treasurer to appear not to be able to know that?
Look, I should have answered the question. In hindsight, that's what I should have done. That's what I would normally do. I didn't want to get into a long discussion about what various thresholds are. I would normally, as I said in many interviews, just answer the question. We were talking about high-income superannuation tax, which is something that Mr Jones and I actually happen to agree on. There's not many things, but we happen to agree that there's a case for more equity there. What I should have done is just simply engage in the question, and then we could have gone on with the facts and the discussion at the time. But as I said, it did lead to 30 seconds of perhaps not the best television viewing.
Or perhaps the most engaging television viewing, depending which way you look at these things. A new term has entered the political lexicon. Last week we had the still unspecified competitive evaluation process, and today it's a value signal. Now, a value signal is what used to be called a GP or Medicare co-payment. But the Health Minister, Susan Lee, is getting about, listening and talking to doctors, determined to put the co-payment policy on what she calls pause. The language is definitely in rewind, though. If the policy comes back, it's unlikely to be called a co-payment. The phrase is a value signal, and this is how Susan Lee explains it.
Well, there is already a value signal, but perhaps it's not working as effectively as it may. What we mean is that people need to value the services that their GPs provide and accept that unless you're in a vulnerable category, maybe those services don't come absolutely for free, and that where there's an ability to pay, in order to value the high quality service that you receive, you do in fact pay something. And when I look at the number of bulk billed consultations across the country, 76% of all episodes of care bulk billed to non-concessional patients. What that tells us is that there are too many consultations too many consultations costing nothing for those who can afford to pay something. So we have to get that balance right, because ultimately, let's not forget that governments don't have money. The Medicare rebate is for the patient. It's their money to enable them to access the doctor and have a high-quality consultation. We've got to make sure that those who can pay a little bit more do, and we continue to protect the vulnerable through bulk billing.